Hello everyone, this is Nyessa, and welcome back to part 2 of the 200 subscriber Q&A session. So in the last session, part 1, we heard questions from the Game Master 332, Pellager, and Jess Mazingful. And right now I'm going to put up on the screen the names of the people whose questions I will answer in part 2. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Our next set of questions comes from Joseph Furlow, and he submitted 5 questions. And the first of them is, why do you do this series instead of other types of content? Now that's kind of a big question, because when it comes to YouTube, I could be doing practically anything. I could, for example, be making knitting tutorial videos, which is something that a couple friends of mine have suggested I do. Or I could be doing a vlog, which is not actually totally out of the question. I may be doing some vlog-type videos at some point every once in a while. But the real reason why I decided to do a bard song rather than something else is that is the whole reason I'm on YouTube in the first place. If it weren't for Edda's story grabbing hold of me and refusing to let go until I did something with it, I would never have created a channel, probably. So basically you have Edda to thank for me being on here at all, and if it weren't for her, I probably wouldn't be here. Joseph's second question is, what gave you the idea to create Edda and her story? Now this is one that I could go on about. There are a couple of different things that inspired the story. First was that I wanted to create a story that had things that I don't see all that often, either in roleplay series or in fantasy stories in general. And one of those things is that fantasy stories often have the lone orphan protagonist, the main character who has no family and doesn't have much of a connection to their own past. And I wanted to create a character who did have strong ties somewhere. Strong ties elsewhere in the world, strong ties to other people. So that is a big part of where Edda's character came into being. And sort of related to that, I see very, very few stories that focus on a mother-daughter relationship. So sometimes I'll see a father-son relationship or a father-daughter relationship, but mothers don't really get a lot of attention in fantasy stories, and that's something that's bothered me for a while. So I decided that Edda's main backstory had to be related to her mother. Another thing that I haven't seen as much as I would like is a protagonist who knows some kind of trade. I mean, we often see the classic farm boy or farm girl hero. We see soldiers, we see hunters, and we even see the occasional scholar, but we don't see a lot of main characters who are creative in some way. We don't see, for example, painters becoming heroes. We don't see architects, and we don't really see many bards. So I wanted to create a protagonist who does know a trade, and specifically a creative craft. And a bard seemed like a logical choice for Skyrim, because that was something that would get her moving around, going to different places, and would fit well into the world itself. Another major influence, though this one is less direct, is actually a couple of blog posts that were written by a friend of mine, Chris Burkeen. And I'm going to go ahead and link those down below, so I strongly encourage you to check them out. They're really fascinating. Basically, what Chris did was analyzed Skyrim from a literary perspective, and he made some connections that really made me appreciate the world and the story of Skyrim much more than I had before. So while they don't really directly influence who Edda is as a character, or necessarily the things that she's going to do over the course of her story, you can definitely see some of those ideas leaking through in different places as we go along. And you'll probably see that more as we go along. It really had an impact on the way that I view the game. And it was actually pretty soon after reading those blog posts that the idea of Edda first occurred to me. So thank you, Chris. And you can all thank Chris for Edda, because I don't know if I would have gotten the idea for her without reading those blog posts. Question number 3 from Joseph is, did Edda have any prerequisite knowledge about Skyrim before coming there? So Edda did know a few things about Skyrim. Of course, her mother is from Skyrim, so she had sort of that background that she learned directly from her mother. And she also grew up in an area of Cyrodiil, which is very strongly influenced by Nord culture. So she did kind of absorb a lot of that as she was growing up. So she has an understanding of a lot of the customs and a lot of the attitudes that you would find in Skyrim, though they're not necessarily ingrained as strongly as they would be if she had actually grown up there. She is also familiar with many of the legends, especially the more famous legends of Skyrim, though again, the version that she knows of each of those stories may not be the same that's most widely told in Skyrim, and they may not be totally accurate because, as she pointed out in a letter to her mother recently, stories change with the telling. So she knows a fair amount, and she understands things like the basic government structure, how the holds are organized, how jarls work, but she doesn't know a lot of the details, and she's not as immersed in Nord culture as she would be if she had actually grown up in Skyrim. But she does have a fair amount of knowledge. Joseph's next question is, do you plan on doing any other series besides Edda? So since I've already answered the question about playing other games, I'll focus my answer now on other Skyrim series. So the short answer is that I don't know at this point. It really depends on a lot of factors, especially on how long a bard song actually lasts, because once I finish Edda's story, I may want to do another Skyrim Let's Play, or I may decide that I would rather focus on another game for my next long-term series. But if I do decide to do Skyrim again, I have 2 ideas that I might like to do. They're both roleplay series, but they're very different styles. So one would be extremely directed and focused on the main quest line to the exclusion of pretty much everything else. It would also be more heavily edited, so I would take out a lot of things like buying and selling and traveling and training. But it would have sort of a twist on the premise of the main story. Now, the other idea that I have is more casual, and it would be mostly dungeon delving, and the idea would be to explore some of the lesser known areas of Skyrim and get to know some of the lesser known followers and companions, or maybe to try out some of the very popular companion mods and quest mods. But it wouldn't be focusing on the main story at all. There wouldn't really be an end goal. It would just be exploration, dungeon delving, gathering treasure, and becoming very, very rich in Skyrim. So those are a couple of ideas that I have. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what kind of character each one would have, But those are some possibilities for the future if I decide to do Skyrim again. The fifth and final question from Joseph Furlow is, lastly, what do you think Edda will need to accomplish before you retire her as a character? Now, this is kind of a big question, and I could approach it from a couple of different angles. So I'm going to start by addressing it in the sort of literary, psychological character development perspective. And I'll tell you that what Edda needs to do is basically figure out her place in the world. Now that's really vague, so I'll get a little bit more specific and say that she needs to find a balance between the competing forces in her life that drive her choices, which are, first, her own desires, what she wants to do. Second, the expectations that other people have for her, especially her mother. And third, this more nebulous concept of fate or destiny. And she has to reconcile these three things and figure out how is she really going to make her own choices based on these competing forces. She also needs to come to an understanding of her family and her relationship with her family. Not just her mother, but, well, other people as well, who we'll be finding more about later on. And she needs to figure out what her family means to her and what impact they really have on her identity. So that's the sort of psychological side of things, the character development. But you may also be wondering, what is she going to do in Skyrim to accomplish this? Or in other words, which quest lines is Edda going to ultimately follow? So without going into too much of spoiler territory, I can tell you that there are 2 quest lines that are absolutely necessary for Edda to go through before her story will be over. And those are probably pretty easy to guess: the main quest line and the Civil War. Now, the main quest of the Dragonborn DLC is not strictly necessary, but I think it's something that would add a lot to her story, so that's also very likely. Other than that, we have the faction quest lines, the Mages Guild, or Mages College, I should say, the Companions, the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, and then we have the other DLC, Dawnguard, and none of those are off the table at this point, though there are certainly some that are more likely than others. However, right now, I don't know for sure which ones Edda is going to do. I have a pretty good idea of which ones are likely to happen, but a lot of it depends on how things go. So when it comes to this series, there are a lot of things that I have planned, and there are a lot of things that I'm leaving to chance. Not exactly chance, but I'm leaving undecided because I want to see how Edda develops as a character. And what I plan right now may not end up feeling natural when I actually get to the point where I have to make those decisions. So, for now, the 2 things that you can definitely count on are the main quest line and the Civil War. But other than that, it's a little bit up in the air, and we'll have to see as we go along. The next couple of questions come from Ian Clarke, who asks, did or does anything in your life influence the character of Edda, or is she a work of total fiction? Now, this is a question that a lot of fiction creators get, especially writers, but I suppose it applies just as easily to role players as well. And I can tell you, for any character will have at least a sliver of the creator as part of them, but very few characters are based primarily on the writer's or the creator's life experiences. Now, Edda has had a very different life than I have. I did not grow up in a small village on a farm. I was not raised by a single mother. I certainly never eloped when I was 15 years old. In fact, I barely had a boyfriend at 15. And I never ran off to the big city when I grew up. But in spite of these differences in life experiences, I have had experiences that have a similar emotional resonance to some of the things that Etta has gone through. So, for example, like many people, I understand what it's like to grow up feeling isolated from other people. And I understand what it's like to want to put all of my time and energy and focus into creative pursuits, but having to put all that aside or put it on the back burner in order to deal with family responsibilities. And even though my mother and Etta's mother are very different people, in fact, they're practically complete opposites of each other, I've also been through this same process of having to sort out the difference between my values and priorities and my parents' values and priorities and figure out what's more important to me. So although Etta's specific life experiences have been very different from me, there's still a lot of me in her. When I look at her, I see myself maybe 5 to 10 years ago. Not because of what she's doing, but because of what she's learning. She's learning some of the same things that I had to learn then, only she's learning them in a very different way and under very different circumstances. Now, Ian also had a follow-up question, which was, or vice versa, are you ever tempted to get a white puppy and name it Garm? Well, not necessarily a white puppy and name it Garm, but actually, speaking of dogs, this goes back to one of the ways in which Etta is directly influenced by my own life, which is that I love dogs. I love dogs so much. I really wish I could have a dog in my apartment. But if I were going to get a dog, probably wouldn't be a white puppy, and I probably wouldn't name it Garm. I would much more likely get a Newfoundland, which is this big black dog, and if I were to get a Newfoundland, if it were a girl, I would name it Emily, and if it were a boy, I would name it Carlo. Bonus points to anyone who knows that reference. However, to get back to the real focus of your question, Etta has actually influenced me in a couple of ways. And the main one is that she has gotten me into music again. I love music, especially I love singing, and Etta's work as a bard going around Skyrim and playing music everywhere has really inspired me again to go back and create music, which is something that I haven't done in quite a while. So you can expect every once in a while to maybe see a little bit of Skyrim-inspired or gaming-inspired music on the channel, like the song that I posted around my birthday. I don't know how often I'll be doing that, but if it weren't for Etta and her character and her interests, I probably wouldn't be doing that at all. In the interest of keeping these videos from getting too long, I'm going to pause here, and I will answer the rest of the questions in part 3.